Over the last 125 years, Jack the Ripper has not only become an international icon of fear, but also a major figure in London folklore.
Welcome to WatchMojoUK, and for this video, we'll be discussing the 10 most terrifying and disturbing British serial killers.
Peter Sutcliffe, the man the press were calling the Yorkshire Ripper, had a cold-blooded MO.
Before we begin, we publish new content every day, so be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos.
For this video, we'll be revealing some of the most notorious serial killers to ever hail from the United Kingdom. Do you have anything to add about the history behind these terrifying tales? Let us know in the comments. Kenneth Erskine. There is no correct demographic when it comes to victims targeted by a serial killer. However, it seems unthinkable to imagine someone like Kenneth Erskine placing the elderly within his crosshairs.
And then suddenly we had this man, the Stockwell Strangler, roaming around the streets of South London, which was horrifying everybody.
Yet, that's who this serial killer, dubbed the Stockwell Strangler, seemed to target during his 1986 attacks. Erskine committed home invasions and assaults within the London area, with a final tally of at least 7 victims before he was brought to justice.
When the end came to Kenneth Erskine's reign of terror, it was with more of a whimper than a bang.
The Stockwell Strangler is currently in detention at Broadmoor Hospital, while his murder convictions were reduced to manslaughter in 2009, after it was found that Erskine suffered from severe mental illness.
There was an appeal made by his defence team to say that he was guilty of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, and so he was moved from a prison to Broadmoor.
Steve Wright. Steve Wright was yet another British serial killer with a set of disturbing monikers, including the Ipswich Ripper and the Suffolk Strangler. Both of these titles tragically fit Wright's modus operandi, that of targeting sex workers in and around the area of Suffolk.
He's targeting these women because they are vulnerable, because they are easy for him to access and easy for him to control.
Wright's violent past has also been tenuously connected with other unsolved crimes, although some of these have been disproven with DNA evidence.
Across the whole of the community, this was a significant event, completely unparalleled as far as I know in the history of Ipswich and that area, which is normally a very quiet rural town.
Still, this matters little when taking into account the frightening brutality with which Wright dispatched his victims during the early and middle noughties. Steve Wright was sentenced to life imprisonment in 2008 with a recommendation that the serial killer never be released.
After only 6 hours of deliberation, the jury found Wright guilty of all 5 murders, and he was sentenced to a whole life term. He was immediately sent to Belmarsh Prison. He will never be released.
Fred and Rosemary West. The happy photos of married couple Fred and Rosemary West belie a horrifying truth. The pair were among Britain's most disturbing serial killers.
Fred West would have thought that people were disposable because, as far as he was concerned, other people were instruments to be used. So there would be no ethical boundaries.
The Wests killed both separately and as a married couple, targeting and torturing young women with no remorse. In fact, it's nearly impossible to describe with sufficient detail the remorseless depravity of the Wests throughout their years of activity.
Some, but not all, future victims would conveniently come from society's margins.
Fred West would have realised that there are plenty of people around who will not be missed.
Rosemary was even responsible for the murder of Fred's own stepdaughter, Charmaine, while her husband is alleged to have murdered over a dozen people. Fred West expired by his own hand in prison in 1995, while Rosemary is serving 10 life terms in His Majesty's Prison New Hall in West Yorkshire.
But the court thought otherwise, and she was convicted of 10 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment.
Amelia Dyer. The crimes of Amelia Dyer became notorious during the days of Victorian London. This was due to Dyer's habitual adoption and elimination of unwanted infants.
Amelia Dyer was a murderer. and she knew what she was doing. This was a calculated career plan that she'd embarked on and sustained over 30 years, come what may.
Historians have pointed out that Dyer actually had children of her own, and at one point took care of youngsters with relatively honest intentions.
A lady is asking, is anybody available to foster her child?
Yeah.
However, at one point it became clear that Dyer's mental state had devolved to the point where that care turned to neglect, abuse and murder. Dyer was eventually hanged for her crimes in 1896, but this didn't bring much justice to those who fell by her hands.
Her death closed a casebook on one of the most deadly serial killer cases in British history.
A number that's claimed by some to be as high as 400. Mary Ann Cotton. Mary Ann Cotton was only convicted for a single murder, that of her stepson Charles. However, it was alleged that this Black Widow was actually a serial killer, a habitual user of poison who was responsible for an alleged 20+ victims.
As soon as they lost some sexual prowess, as soon as they lost their jobs or became ill and couldn't get the money to bring into the house, she was after the next man. And she was making love to her next husband while killing the husband she was with.
Cotton was said to have utilised arsenic to take the lives of some of her own, as well as a number of her husbands.
That the more she did it and got away with it, the more she was motivated to keep on doing it. It was almost a feeling of power.
She was eventually caught and hanged for her crimes. There has been some conjecture surrounding the manner of her death, specifically the legend that the rope used to hang Cotton was drawn short on purpose.
She actually had the worst hangman in Britain, who was in his 70s, very frail and weak, had a reputation for being cruel, didn't used to hang them properly.
This was in order to make the Black Widow suffer from strangulation, as opposed to the comparatively quick death afforded by a broken neck. John Christie. John Reginald Christie lived at 10 Rillington Place. This was also the address where Christie was said to have committed some truly ghastly crimes.
Christie was a monster that had been going for years and murdering girls left, right and centre.
Specifically, Christie was said to have disposed of the remains of these murder victims within the walls of his home, as well as in an outside garden. The serial killer also allowed an innocent man, Timothy Evans, to initially hang for the crimes Christie committed.
The jury found Evans guilty of murder. He was sentenced to death. Christie's evidence had been instrumental in convicting the trusting young man.
Although John Christie eventually went to the gallows himself, his gruesome methodology and unrepentant behaviour made him a chilling example of humanity at its absolute worst. Harold Shipman. We trust doctors every day to do right by us, literally placing our lives and well-being in the care of their trained hands.
He was a doctor, he had power over life and death, and somehow he seemed to get some kick from exploiting that. I mean, it's very hard to imagine.
Yet what happens when a physician breaks that trust? Enter Harold Shipman, also known as Dr. Death. It's alleged that potentially over 200 people died at the hands of Dr. Shipman, who perverted a trust that eventually cost his patients their lives.
I don't think that Shipman's victims knew that they were going to die. As far as they were concerned, quite often, Dr. Shipman was treating them.
Shipman was said to have focused his lethal efforts on senior citizens in his care, over-prescribing medication that would eventually lead to their deaths. Harold Shipman was eventually brought to justice, but took his own life while serving a life sentence at His Majesty's Prison, Wakefield.
In a heartless move, Shipman decided to take all his secrets to the grave.
Dennis Nilsen. There are a number of gruesome comparisons to the life and crimes of Scotland's Dennis Nilsen and that of infamous American serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer. Both Nilsen and Dahmer tended to target boys and young men, while their methodology often included post-mortem abuse and manipulation. Nilsen often lured his victims to a dual set of addresses held by the killer in North London. It was this setting that ultimately proved to be Nilsen's undoing, however, thanks to the killer's penchant for flushing human remains down the toilet. Specifically, plumbing issues resulted in a local plumbing company discovering bones and flesh trapped within the pipes. It was this evidence that assisted in bringing Dennis Nilsen, aka the Muswell Hill murderer, to justice.
He would have to serve at least 25 years before he'd be considered for parole. In 1994, the Home Secretary made the decision to change Nilsen's sentence to a whole life tariff.
Peter Sutcliffe. The man was dubbed the Yorkshire Ripper, a terrifying British serial killer that prowled the streets of West Yorkshire and Manchester back in the 1970s.
The whole of Britain was terrified by the elusive murderer who seemed to kill for his own enjoyment.
His name was Peter Sutcliffe, and he terrorised women and young girls, particularly those who were involved in the sex industry. Sutcliffe was said to have heard voices that drove him to these crimes of violence and sexual assault, attacks that were shockingly violent in nature.
And even Peter Sutcliffe himself has said, I got to the point where I thought I must be invisible. So he got to a stage where he felt untouchable. He felt so powerful, he thought that he was never going to get caught.
The Yorkshire Ripper was active for about 5 frightening years before finally being caught and sentenced to life imprisonment with 20 concurrent sentences. Peter Sutcliffe eventually died in prison on November 13th, 2020.
Sutcliffe's legacy casts a deathly shadow over the lives he took and the lives he left behind.
Jack the Ripper. We will probably never know the true identity behind whoever was responsible for the Whitechapel murders.
Jack the Ripper is a legend, but we mustn't forget his victims. These are women who, whatever the condition of their life, did not deserve to be murdered.
As a result, it also feels confidently probable that no one will ever trump Jack the Ripper's reputation as the UK's most notoriously terrifying and disturbing serial killer.
I think the one thing that holds everything together, that keeps everyone coming back to it, is the fact that it's a mystery. You know, despite the fact that there's been loads of people who think they know who Jack the Ripper is, in honesty, we don't know.
The stories surrounding Bloody Jack never seem to end, from the taunting letters sent by a man who seemed perversely proud of his work to the sheer brutality of the Ripper's crimes.
It was a very mocking letter, mocking the police for failing to catch him, threatening more murders and such like. But at the end, he signed himself, yours truly, Jack the Ripper. And that's the first time anyone ever saw that name.
This was a legend of eternal evil, a ghost from the Victorian era that continues to haunt the collective memory of British history and true crime.